This gets us into the 70s and 80s. Nixon's administration, and the brief period of Carter's administration, and then Reagan's administration. And so certainly free market economists see this as a moment of enlightenment, especially under Reagan and Reaganomics. But also, this was the period of this slow defeat of totalitarian regimes in the Soviet Union. Of course, hopefully none of us conflate all of that totalitarian stuff with communism or socialism, and that's one of the ways that the products of this era is, even to this day, the term socialism and communism is sullied because it's conflated with Stalinism and forms of totalitarianism. But the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the belief that we had reached what Fukuyama calls the end of history, that this kind of capitalist free market version of laissez-faire democracy was the ideology, the practice that won all of history, and that would bring about the types of things that the Enlightenment was trying to realize. So we might, though there are a lot of problems with that, obviously, mark that as the kind of Enlightenment that was happening. But also, this is the era of the Rockefeller drug laws, 1973, the war on drugs and the war on crime, which is exactly what we're going to look at in much more detail in our discussions of the carceral explosion in the 70s and the 80s, all the way up through the 2000s. This, if we kind of just momentarily mark some other moments at the end of the 20th century, this is the birth of neoliberalism, or at least the kind of instantiation of it as the major mode of practice. So even if you believe in that kind of Republican Democrat game, as though they're doing different things economically, neoliberalism was the co-optation or the lack of critical engagement with anything with itself, with capitalism. So capitalism was just assumed to be the only way that we could do economics. Of course, Mark Fisher, in his recent book on capitalist realism, talks about this, about how for many, capitalism is just, there's no outside, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Now, there may be things like the climate crisis, like the social unrest that's caused by, contributed to by the climate crisis, but caused by decades of neglect, and maybe even this global health crisis with coronavirus might be the things that penetrate through this all-encompassing view of capitalism. But this kind of began in the 90s, certainly in this country with Clinton, but also overseas with people like Tony Blair. And then but it was a huge economic boom as well. It was a huge, one of the first times that, we didn't really have a debt. There was a budget surplus even, which for many people saw that even if they were being left behind in terms of the big picture and in terms of the way that inequality was being exacerbated, were fine, because at least they had, their mortgage and their picket fence and their 2.3 kids and their flat screen TV or whatever it was. But this was also in 1994, and this, of course, is the one that is often held up to Joe Biden, because he was voted for this and was instrumental in its creation and activation, was the Violent Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. That put 100,000 new police officers on the street, $9.7 billion in funding for prisons, and $6.1 billion in funding for prevention programs. This was at the same time when Pell Grants were kind of cut back. I could be wrong about that. So this was the instantiation of Pell Grants, but then they were cut back in, I'll have to look at when that was. We'll talk about that. So there was the Federal Assault Weapons Ban, the Death Penalty Act, the elimination of, it was. Okay. Yeah, I was right. This was the elimination of inmate education. I'm using language they have here, is elimination of inmate education. The Violence Against Women Act, the Driver's Privacy Protection Act, all of that was part of this, another huge law enforcement and crime bill. And then, even though it's seemingly not directly related to the issue of incarceration, but very important in terms of the way that exclusion and poverty contributes to the criminalization of certain populations, was the 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, which was the end of welfare as we know it. It ended welfare as a so-called entitlement program, required recipients to begin working after 2 years of receiving the benefits. It placed a lifetime limit of 5 years on benefits paid. It aimed to encourage two-parent families and discouraged out-of-wedlock births, so already a kind of very bourgeois, heteronormative notion of what constitutes a family, what constitutes participation in the economy, and so there's embedded in that as a kind of morality and sense of participation in what is the American way. The enhancing enforcement of child support, and the requiring state professionals and occupational licenses to be withheld from undocumented persons. So this was a huge destruction of those types of social safety nets that are embedded in the language of those early documents about universal rights and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all of those kinds of things. Those become impossible if you don't have the basic material conditions that allow for individuals and communities to even have access to that dream. And so this was done under a Democratic administration, but it was a huge victory for the type of free market of conservative neoliberal policies that were further legally excluding, marginalizing, demonizing other populations. And so you had a way of further throwing them into situations that were more likely to be criminalized, whether it was addiction or mental health, or finding alternative economies to support their families and their communities. And so the way that is dealt with is to, instead of address those systemic social problems, is to criminalize, to then capture that population, to warehouse them, to other them, all of the language that's still very much with us, like the welfare queen and the crackhead. And of course, I'm putting those in quotes because they are extremely violent, extremely problematic, extremely another way of othering a person so that they don't have to be considered a full person, and therefore can be treated in ways that in our kind of everyday morality we would recoil and rebel against as being not just inhumane, but forms of violence and torture. So that gets us to where we need to be in terms of the beginning of the carceral explosion. So in the next series of lectures, we'll look at that. We'll start back with 1971 with the Attica prison uprising. We'll start back with 1971, the Attica prison uprising, George Jackson, and try to get us through the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century.